All right, everyone. Welcome to our panel, SEL from 9 to 5, Social Emotional Skills in Our Workforce, where we'll discuss how social emotional skills not only contribute to success in classrooms, but also in the professional world. So a quick note about tech. Please ask any questions using the Q&A function on the top right. You can ask questions privately, and we'll get to some of them at the end. And then also use the chat right now to introduce yourself, where you're from, and what you do, and just also throughout the session to engage with us and with others. So would love to see y'all just blowing up the chat and letting us know who you are and where you're dialing in from. And we will get started with an introduction to our speakers for today. So first we have Ashanti Osborne. Ashanti is the Assistant VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Global Atlantic Financial Company. She focuses on developing and executing the strategy for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And she's been recognized for her process improvement skills, leading enterprise efforts, and championing people and culture. So welcome, Ashanti. We next have Ariel Lopez. Ariel is the founder and CEO of NAC, a hiring platform that helps companies better manage and track applicants so they don't miss out on great talent. She has over a decade of recruiting experience, has helped companies like Spotify, Uber, Google, Nike, eBay, and more build great teams. She's helped thousands of professionals find career happiness and has been featured in publications like CNBC, Forbes, Fast Company, Refinery 29, Business Insider, and others to share advice. So welcome, Ariel. Next, we have Ray Batra. Ray is CEO of Shift Up, a company helping government agencies run more effective job training for the unemployed. Ray is also co-founder of Future of Higher Ed, a global community of 800 plus higher ed and workforce entrepreneurs. Ray deeply understands the importance of SEL in education, drawing from his personal experience building Shift Up and prior work leading an after-school youth program. And last but not least, we have Emily Christopher. Emily is the Chief Talent Officer at Public Preparatory Network in New York City. There, Emily oversees human resources and talent strategy for the network of schools. Before joining the Public Prep team, Emily was the Director of Operations at one of Public Prep schools, Girls Prep Lower East Side Middle School, and she also coaches girls basketball there. So welcome to all of our panelists. And we are just going to go ahead and dive into some of these questions because we are very excited to learn more about how SEL will transfer into the workplace. So this one's for everyone. Our first question is, what does our SEL Symposium theme, not a moment, but a movement, mean to you and your work? And Ashanti, I'll start with you.
Absolutely. And hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining. I'm really looking forward to the discussion this afternoon. And I just want to preface that a lot of my responses will be very much from the diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. And so when I think about a moment versus a movement, I first like to define the way that I see the difference between the two. And so, I define a moment as something that happens for a period of time. It's a specific instance, it's short lived, and a movement is really something more transformative. It is something that requires the physical change of an item, a structure, a design. And over the past several centuries, historical marginalized groups have experienced many moments and movements in between, right? As we continue to fight for equity, equality, and inclusion. And what we've witnessed in 2020 was a tipping point, right? So we, in some instances, participated ourselves and witnessed protests against police brutality of Black people, anti-Semitic behaviors, the rise in violence against Asians, and more. And additionally, we're also experiencing another pandemic, right, with COVID-19, which elevates and exacerbates another set of issues when we talk about health inequities and access. And it really has been the confluence of all of these things that really has created the tipping point. And suddenly the world has woken up to say, oh, you all are experiencing all of these inequities. And I feel like from a corporate perspective, that is where we've seen a lot of the support from leaders around a lot of the things that we have been experiencing for a very long time. And so within my role within diversity, equity, inclusion, it's very important for me to ensure that this is very much a movement and that it continues. And so that is where we talk about strategic actions versus performative actions. So we want to go beyond LinkedIn posts and hashtags and articles and things of that sort and start to make significant investments in how we bring in diverse talent, how we retain them, how we develop them, how we promote them, and looking at that from all entry points and all levels. And so it's very important and personally important for me to ensure that we continue to build upon this momentum and that we continue to move the needle in this space.
That's amazing. Thank you, Ashanti. Ariel, same question.
I would probably give Ashanti's answer, to be quite honest. I myself have been doing work in diversity and inclusion before it became the cool thing to do. To me, when I think of a movement versus a moment, unfortunately, I think D&I service for a lot of companies. It's kind of the box to check and not necessarily seeing it as fundamental to your business and overall just a priority. So much of my work is focused on holding companies accountable, ensuring that their recruiting and their hiring practices are fair and inclusive. And then since I'm also a career coach, I spend a lot of time just thinking about how do we essentially just close any barriers to access that may exist, specifically from people that are coming from marginalized groups. I'm so happy to see so many women of color on the panel today, but typically when I do these panels, I'm usually the only one. So I think representation has a lot to do with that as well. And I think something else that is top of mind is just what the future of work looks like. So if you've heard of the Great Resignation, this is something that I don't think is a moment. I think it actually has turned into a movement. So just kind of looking into the future of work, thinking about what people value in their roles. A big shift has happened since the beginning of COVID until now. If you were to look at the data, I would say that anyone pre-COVID, the number one thing that they were looking for in a job was to make sure that they have the highest salary possible. Now it's making sure that the company is a lifestyle fit and that they are actually supporting not only you wherever you are in your life, but kind of catapulting you to that next level as well. So very much thinking about how society is starting to shift things that could be momentary, but actually turn them into movements as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Ray, this SEL theme, not a moment, but a movement. What does that mean to you and your work?
Yeah, so I would echo first, of course, especially what Ashanti had said. I think one of the main things in mine is a level of permanence of importance, basically moving it to the front and center of a lot of conversations around education and training, as opposed to sort of on the periphery. For us, for our work specifically, actually, when I built the company, when I started building it a few years ago, we built out a strategy deck, right? And for that. Thinking about what are the three core pillars for us and sort of what we're trying to do. Those pillars was one of them was around helping individuals figure out what they want to do, exploration and kind of who they want to be as human beings. One part was technical training. You need the skills to be able to get wherever you want to go. But the third one, at absolutely equal weight as the other two, if not more so, is SEL, right? Anyway, so that's not news to people here, I suppose, but at the same time, I think it is often put on the back burner in the world that I come from, which is sort of more job training and workforce. Is usually the emphasis is hugely in the land of technical skills and technical training versus non-technical and SEL. That needs to change.
Yes. Thank you. And Emily, take this one.
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of what comes to mind when I think about not a moment, but a movement, especially in my work working directly in the field of education, is that honestly, nothing is a moment. Everything is a part of this larger movement, especially the work that we're doing with our students, preparing them for what's to come, right? The space that we're in now is because of youth, children who have grown and developed over time, their perspectives, their beliefs, their desires to see what they want this country to be. And they've created the space that we're currently all existing in, right? And help drive really important conversations about making sure that we not only think about the material parts of this world, which is always a huge part of a patriarchal system, but that we're also thinking about the emotional and social parts of this world, and that we're providing spaces for care and self-care for each other. And so in my work, I work with adults, but we all work for our students. And so when I think about each individual moment that a teacher has in their classroom with their children, in reality, we're talking about the work they're doing is really about what's happening 10, 15, 20 years down the line. So really all of this is a movement. And I think if we think about it as a moment, right, we can get lost in a quick win is a win, when in reality, it takes a succession of small victories to get to the places that we are now. It took a succession of people going through roles for Ketanji to get into that seat she's in. It took a succession of people to move and develop in the political spaces for things to happen in so many parts of our country. In the same way, like it's taken a succession of people getting power for laws and things to be taken away, right? Everything is a part of a larger movement. And so I just truly believe this work of SEL, I'm so glad it's coming to the forefront, especially in my work in leading adults, that we're now having much deeper conversations about how we not just manage people, but care for them. Because, people don't leave jobs, they leave people. And if we think about each individual person as somebody who's just kind of coming through the system, then we miss out on potential impact they can have for our students, and which of course directly implicates like for the future.
Thank you, Emily. Ray, I'm going to come to you first on this one. What social emotional skills are most useful to develop in order to successfully navigate the transition from being primarily a student to building a career?
Yeah. Well, I'll say first, I think there's a strong amount of overlap. I mean, it's not the same, but there certainly are skills that are going to help you out to be, awesome as a student otherwise. But I will say what we've seen through our programs and working with hundreds of individuals and companies, some that stick out to me are proactiveness, like as sort of, in other words, and I don't know if this is exactly how you're thinking about the question, but when you said that, that's how I'm interpreting it. When you move into the workforce, right, you got to stand out, right? Which is a challenge. I mean, a lot of companies are having hundreds of applicants, right? In some cases, thousands for things. And one of the ways you stand out is to be, to get in the minds, empathy as well with the minds of the recruiter. What do they need? What would they be thinking if they had hundreds of candidates? So you have to have empathy. You're going to be proactive. That might mean figuring out creative ways to, in some cases, you need to have strong self-management skills. When we think about self-management skills, we're talking about organization. Time management is critical because you're also going to want to prove that you're really creating value for your employer, right, in some way. And to do that, you need to be really the more hyper efficient and organized you can be, the better. Reliability is huge, right? So you got to be able to show up on time, do what you're going to say that you're going to do. Written communication is huge, right? So there's a different layer of expectations and etiquette that a lot of folks coming out of school aren't necessarily familiar with. And so it will be to your benefit to really understand and seek out what are the expectations in the environment in which you want to go, right? What are the and a lot of that can be found out through mentorship, through Googling, through other stuff. But that's where also the proactiveness comes into. So those are a few of them, but there's obviously a lot more.
Yes, thank you. Ariel, what would you add to that in terms of SEL skills most useful to develop in order to navigate from being a student to building a career?
Yeah, I will speak from the perspective of working in tech, or if you wanted to work at a startup, because I think the list of things looks a little bit different depending on the industry that you actually decide to pursue. I think being a problem solver, being a self-starter is probably where I would start. Someone that is naturally curious, a go-getter. I will always kind of go back to fundamentally being a problem solver as well, because I think some people don't realize the only reason the job is open is because a void needs to be filled. So the easier you can explain how you will be a value add, not only to the team, but to the overall organization, it makes it a lot easier for you to move up as well. I think empathy, especially if we're thinking about anyone that would pursue a career in design, especially, you have to have empathy towards the end user or the customer or whoever you're building a product or service for. And I would definitely say just overall good communication skills. Like people underestimate how far you can get just knowing how to talk to people, having strong presentation skills, especially as we think of that journey from being junior in your career to ultimately leading, going into senior and leadership positions and roles as well. Before you can become a good manager, you actually have to start to just kind of figure out essentially like what exactly you're bringing to the organization and how you're going to be helping people.
Nice, thank you. And Emily, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's so many key skills. And I'm literally like today running some hiring processes for some really important roles. And I think a couple of things that really rise to the top from an SEL perspective. One's is the lens around like equity and thinking about how you play a role in a company's culture, how you play a role in the company's mission and their vision and where they're trying to grow from that lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Another one is it's been named, but it's just so important to be a collaborative communicator, to be someone who is clear in your communication and able to like voice how you're feeling about stuff without having to like, sometimes code switching can be difficult depending on the context that you're in, but being able to effectively communicate how you are feeling and able to do that in a way that you don't lose respect from other people, that you're able to build relationship, because you can very openly voice how you're feeling about something without having to be inappropriate or without having to be disrespectful or without having to be rude. I think another one that's really important from an SEL perspective is continuously being reflective and being a lifelong learner. Knowing that you're coming into a space, you should always be thinking about how you can get to the next level, and not saying like grow to the next job all the time, but how are you thinking about your individual skills and how you can grow, and having a slice of humble pie, to be quite frank, knowing that even though you may have come in as the best candidate, there are still things you can do to get better, to be more effective, to be more efficient, and recognize that you're always interviewing for the next role. I think one other thing that I would name it from an from an SEL perspective really is that EQ. Like it's not just about like knowing what to say and when to say it, but having clear knowledge of what the bar is and figuring out how do you position yourself to meet that bar consistently is really important. I often see candidates who come in and can really speak to their technical skills well, but if we do a role play about how to like talk to somebody, they're fumbling and it's difficult. And so really thinking about how do you leverage that EQ to think about how might I be different as an individual from the parties that I'm talking to, from the people I might be coaching, from the people who might be my peers. And so recognizing that you have to an extent, be flexible with your approach depending on who you're going to be interacting with, because you might talk to somebody who's really solutions oriented and you are too. So you speak the same language. And so it's really easy to have that conversation. And then the next person you talk to is actually much more relational. Like they need to know about who you are before they decide if they want to deeply engage in a conversation with you. So you can't bypass the, hey, how are you? How was your weekend? It's really important that you stop there before you get into the work with that type of individual. So that EQ of just like knowing your audience and knowing what you're really striving for in the work, and that way you can create alignment, is just critically important in the workforce.
Thanks for that, Emily. I'm like thinking of my coworkers and realizing these different types of people I work with. So that's really helpful. Ashanti.
Yeah, and so I think all of the things my co-panelists have said, if I think that there's, one skill that I would add to that, it's the power of your voice and understanding how to effectively use that and properly advocate for yourself. So really focusing on how you build those skills that will help you successfully navigate and meaningfully contribute to discussions, how you can raise problems and identify solutions in a productive manner, how you can challenge the inequities that you see in a thoughtful way, turn into a negative experience for those that you are engaging with. And so I think that the power of your voice is really, really important. And I think that that spills over even when you talk about how you engage within the workplace, but even in your personal life, right? Even within healthcare and all of these things, really understanding how to advocate for yourself, how to use your voice, and to effectively navigate between different types of conversations. So I think that's the one thing that I would add to the discussion.
That's good. Thank you. This is a similar question, but I want to hear if you have additional thoughts on this. So how do you see social emotional skills helping adults progress in their careers? So we talked about them transitioning from being students into getting into the workforce, but is there anything else you would add for how they would progress in their careers? Ariel, I'll start with you.
I think understanding how to cultivate and build relationships is the biggest thing that you can do, especially early on in your career. One of my mantras is put yourself on people's radars before they know who you are or before they actually meet you. So being active, being consistent, it's really, really easy to get in touch with anyone. I'm a big believer in connecting with people, especially on social media, whether it be LinkedIn or Twitter. Twitter is one of my favorite places to get in touch with folks. And I think that's a huge benefit that this generation has, is just having that access that we didn't necessarily have when we were coming up. That being said, once you get your foot in the door, it is those relationships that ultimately will define the trajectory of your career. 80% of jobs are found through referrals. A lot of my work is to kind of dismantle that system that is not necessarily super efficient, and it obviously doesn't give everyone as much access as we would like. But I also think people need to use that as power in understanding how positions are found, how people are able to accelerate and kind of move up in their careers. And so much of that is just knowing the right people and maintaining those relationships as well. So if you do nothing else, make sure that you follow the panelists that are here today, you connect with them, you learn more about them. You never know who could be beneficial to you in the future.
That's great. Great advice. Emily, I see you nodding furiously, so I'm coming to you.
She's dropping some gems. Yes, very aligned. Again, I'm sitting here in the midst of an interview day, and I was so glad I was able to step away for this conversation because I think it's just so timely and important. But those social emotional skills in terms of wanting to progress in your career, when I look across my team, like our C-suite, and then I look at like the people who report into us and the people who are 2 levels and 3 levels down, I just think about the progression of certain skills that are really important to be able to be in a C-suite type of position. And I often think about how are we preparing folks to be able to grow to each level that prepares them for C-suite, right? And I think by the time you get to like a C-suite level, a big part of your social emotional skill really is more about people. You're not doing the actual tasks anymore. You're driving teams and leading people. And so while you might have been a really good player, it's very different to be a coach. And it's another thing to be a player coach. And so when you think about the social emotional skills, really as you look to grow in your career, and I would honestly even like start in your career. We talked about a couple of those key skills to develop in order to navigate moving into a space. But if you want to grow, one, you have to be open to getting direct feedback, and you actually have to be humble enough to like also go seek that feedback. If you're waiting for somebody to come to you, it's already too late. It's already too late. If somebody's bringing you feedback and it's your first time hearing it, it's likely that and it's not necessarily positive feedback. It's likely that you've missed some opportunity to have some key conversations before it got to that point that would allow you to be a collaborative part of your growth conversation versus being the recipient of a growth conversation. And so for me, the biggest thing around social emotional skills to progress, it is that you have to be hungry for that feedback. You have to want to get feedback from people that are different from you, not just those who are like your champions and who are the same as you, but people who are different from you. You want to think about getting feedback from different levels. So those who report into you, as well as those who report, who also who oversee your work. You also have to think about getting support from and thinking about how you collaborate with your peers too, right? Because in most situations, your peers are some of those key champions that you need to make sure are in your corner, because in most situations, those are the ones who you're working on projects with. Those are the ones who you're collaborating with. And if at any point in time you need a reference for something, it's very likely, especially if it's internal that you're growing, they're going to go talk to those people you spend the most time with to see who you really are, right? And so you really want to continue to be authentic, but really seek that feedback, because I think that's what allows us all to continue to grow. And in the absence of getting feedback and feeling like you're comfortable, what's going to happen is you're going to get passed by. Somebody else is going to pass you by. Someone's going to get that promotion that you wanted. Someone's going to get that seat you wanted. You might have had the biggest idea in the world, and because you hadn't built those relationships and like sought out the spaces where you could create influence, now you've missed an opportunity that could have been pivotal to turn in your career that could put you on the pathway you want. So just like be humble, like be humble and know that you don't know everything. And also recognize that just because somebody might be your boss doesn't mean they know everything too. So it's not just contingent on your boss being the one that grows you, but you have to take responsibility for your own growth, as well as ensuring that you have the mindset and the wherewithal to say, I want to get there, create your own path there. If you're waiting for somebody to write that path for you, again, it's going to be too late. Someone's going to get there before you. You have to be proactive and get that feedback and drive that ship for yourself.
Yes. Thank you, Emily. I'm seeing people in the chat. It sounds like you're blowing people's minds. So thank you. Ray, I'm going to come to you for the question of SEL skills and how you can use them to progress your career.
Yeah, so there's a few points, and some of these, this is sparking ideas. And one thing I want to jump on immediately is, from my experience the last few years, especially building companies, we also, like everybody in their careers, have different points of rejection and failure and things like that, right? So from us, you're going out to raise money to build a business, you're going to get rejected probably hundreds of times, right? In my case, it was over 300 times. And to do that, everybody's going to give you feedback. And so one of the things that is a really key lesson to realize is you got to be able to filter, right? Filter feedback, understand where that feedback's coming from, what the point of view is. Is this person actually coming from, from the seat that you want to be at, right? Have they done what you want to be doing? It doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad if they haven't, but it's an important thing to consider. So that's just kind of one point on feedback in general. The other thing I wanted to talk about is, I'm actually going to drop this in the chat right now. There might be a big ping, but let's see. I don't know. But anyway, I highly recommend this book. I'm curious if any of you are familiar with it. It's called The Startup of You, basically applying principles of the startup environment to one's own careers. Is written by Reid Hoffman, who is the co-founder at LinkedIn, as some other folks. Highly recommend that book as you think about progressing careers. And then the other point I wanted to make, which was more along the original lines, is in the tech community, and especially in, for web developers in particular, there's a term that a lot of folks will use called a code monkey. And they'll say, it's easy to become a code monkey, which basically means it's easy to learn, in 8 weeks or 12 weeks, some basic code in order to, get a basic website, up and running. But that's pretty much all you can do. You can't really progress in your career just to be a code monkey, which means, hey, I've just learned a little bit of the technical skills off the bat, just enough. You got to really dig in. You got to develop your own skills. You got to, and then do everything else that Ariel and Emily and others have talked about around not just SEL, but also deepening your skills there. So I guess my point is, it's relatively easy to get your foot in the door as a quote unquote code monkey, but to progress, you need to deepen those skills, build those relationships, build the feedback, filters that you have. And then I guess the last point I'll say is, there's a term some of you may be familiar with called managing up and managing down, right? Which in a nutshell basically means you're learning how to manage relationships with your superiors and sort of those who are your managers, also those who are peers to you and those who are reporting to you. And so those are all very important skills, different skills that become more and more important as you're thinking about growing in your career.
Awesome. Thank you, Ray. And then Ashanti, your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in today's world, the requirements of leadership has changed, right? And so, it's no longer, as many of my co-panelists talked about, it's no longer good enough just to manage people, right? The tenets of leadership is training to where you need to engage, inspire the people in which you are leading. And that is why empathy is coming up as something that is more and more important and a critical skill for leaders just across the board. And a lot of people right now are experiencing a lot of stress and trauma with all of the things that are happening in the world right now. And it elevates the need for leaders to really tap into that EQ, to be empathetic. I think there was a study that said 47% of people have experienced a decline in mental health, right? That's huge. And these are because of all the things that have been happening with the pandemic. And so when you talk about empathetic leadership and a leader's ability to connect with people, to show understanding, to shift, to be agile, to be flexible, it's really important as you continue to develop those that are working on your team. So if I could say that one thing that's critically important is to understand empathy, understand how to build that capability, because it's critical now more than ever.
Thank you. Just to let the audience know, in a few minutes, about 4 minutes, I'm going to open this up to Q&A. So please click the Q&A button and throw your questions in there, and then we'll toss them to the panelists. As we get closer to that section, I'm going to drop down to just two of you at a time. So Emily, I'm going to start with you. This will be for Emily and Ariel. What social emotional skills do you look or listen for during the hiring process?
That's a really great question. And I will say that it does shift depending on what type of role we're hiring for, right? Certain skills, certain levels, if you're looking at entry level versus senior level versus mid-level leader, et cetera. But I think across the board, it goes back to some of those key social emotional skills we discussed at the top of the call, which, you're thinking about communication skills, you're thinking about reflection, growth mindset, you're thinking about their ability to continue to learn and be adaptive and innovative. I also think about, I think Ray mentioned this, but like those organizational skills, like how do they organize their mind, their time, like all the things are really, really important. Ultimately, the way that we set up a lot of our structures is that there are built-in activities, which then you get feedback in real time, and we see how you implement said feedback. So we might do a role play of a scenario or a conversation with like a student and a parent, right? And we'll have somebody playing the roles, and we'll go through that situation, and we'll cut it at the end, and we'll say, okay, great, what do you think you did well, what do you think you didn't do well in that conversation? If you could go back and do it again, what would you do differently? And we let them give their feedback of like their self-reflection. Then we go to the person who was playing the role, and we say, how was that experience for you? And like, you need to tell them like tell this person directly, how was the experience for you? Did you feel heard? Did you feel seen? Like, give them feedback. And then we go back to the candidate and say, based off of that feedback, again, would you do anything differently? Right? Like, how can they receive feedback, which sometimes getting it in the moment can be really uncomfortable. But to an extent, the best candidates are always, they might say, that's a really great question. In reflection, I would maybe approach this one or two things differently. And I think those are the most powerful conversations that we have. And consistently, when we have conversations and experiences with folks, they always name, like, that's like, they really appreciate that feedback. And often we hear that they don't get feedback like that often in their work. No one's giving them real-time direct feedback about the work that they're doing or the conversations that they're having or the approaches that they're taking. You often hear about it after somebody complains. You never just get it on the front end. It's always after something seemingly has blown up. And I think that's, to an extent, just kind of baked into who we are as a society. Like, we always want to react versus respond. But how do you begin to build that practice? You make it a part of your everyday practice. And so for us, as a part of hiring, I can teach you a skill, but it's much more difficult to teach you how to talk to people. Mm-hmm. And so I need to understand, do I have people that know how to talk to people? Because we're in the people business. We're building little people. And so if I have adults that can't talk to adults, I probably will have some adults that can't talk to kids. So it really starts from the top down. A fish rots from the head down. Like, you just got to make sure that those communication skills and that reflection around your communication and the way that you're impacting other people is top of mind in hiring.
Yeah. Emily, I'm going to put you on the spot for a minute, but I'm curious, what would it sound like for them to not be reflective? Have you heard some of those in the hire? What does that sound like?
Oh, absolutely. I had somebody 2 days ago, and I was like, interesting response that you think that you did everything perfectly. Ultimately, some folks will say like, that's helpful feedback, and then they become defensive. But I said it this way because of, I did this because, and it's like, or did you even hear what they said in terms of the feedback? The person literally, almost like layman's terms says, like, you hurt my feelings. And your response is, like, they may not have said that, but like, they might share something along those lines, that sentiment. And it's often that somebody's like, people are uncomfortable when people are talking about feelings. And so they go to find the fastest way out of that conversation. And so many times it becomes deflection and defense, where like they want to defend their stance and why they said it this way versus another way. Other times it becomes a like, yeah, thanks for the feedback, that's helpful. But there's no like internalization, no acknowledgement. There's no, it's almost like they've responded so fast. It's like, did you actually consider what this person said? So it can look different depending on the person. And I hate to throw like gender biases out there, but it's always interesting that I see like male candidates struggle more in those types of conversations and interactions than female candidates, where a female candidate will at least be like, that's interesting, and then maybe move forward, where a male candidate is like, great, got it, heard you, thank you. So I think one thing for any of the men who are out there is always think about, like, sometimes depending on which sector you're working with, who's on that hiring committee, that team, again, thinking about knowing your audience, pushing yourself be outside of your comfort zone. It might, if feelings are not your thing and you're looking for a role where you're working with a lot of people, you might have to lean into some of that, because you're not going to be successful if you're just trying to push the envelope forward without recognizing that you have to do it through people. You can't do things to people. You have to do things through people, depending on what level you're working in an organization.
That's great. That's helpful. Thanks. Ariel, I'm going to throw it to you. And then as soon as you wrap, we're going to head into this Q&A. So any additional thoughts for what you listen for during the hiring process?
For sure. I'm going to keep it super brief because I know we need to go into Q&A. So I will reemphasize good communication skills. I think the first question in most interviews is, tell me about yourself. And it's one of those questions, you'd be surprised how many people, regardless of how many years of experience they've had, I've seen Harvard Business School folks like still not come up with a good answer to that. So I think understanding the importance of storytelling, especially understanding your narrative. Ashanti kind of touched on this earlier on the power of your voice. I find that the people that are most successful in their career, and definitely people that interview well, are those that understand how to storytell. They understand what their narrative is. They understand how they are a value add, and they're able to articulate that in a way to get recruiters excited. I would say being curious. So asking good questions. Please do not do an interview and they ask you, do you have any questions for me at the end? And you're like, no, I think I'm good here. Please remember that you are interviewing the company just as much as they are interviewing you. And this is your opportunity to really get an understanding of all the things that are not on the job description, understanding of what you're actually signing up for, if this is an opportunity that's going to be a good fit for you. But I also think this gives the recruiter a good opportunity to kind of see, what is this person thinking about? And it's always a good preview of likely how you would be if we were to hire you. A fast learner, certainly understanding the landscape, especially in tech. There's new technologies every day. There's new trends. We still had living social, Web3 and NFTs, from crypto to blockchain. Being well versed on what's happening in the space, especially if you're targeting a company that is in with one of those niches. And then last but not least, creativity. So I love people that kind of raise the bar. Don't just simply apply for a job and submit your resume. Find ways to just kind of go above and beyond, because it helps you stand out from the competition. I always bring up an example. There was a girl that applied for a job at Airbnb. And essentially, she built a business case for Airbnb. She listed all the cities where they weren't currently operating, and essentially kind of explained how much money they could be making if they were to operate in those cities. And she did a ton of research, and it was super thorough, and it was just really impressive. Airbnb did not hire her because they're crazy, but she got contacted by over 1,000 recruiters. And she is happily employed right now. I will find the link and I'll share it out to you guys. But being creative, definitely, especially in the interview process, is something that you want to do as well.
That's great. All right, y'all, we are down to our last 5 minutes and we have about 5 excellent questions in the chat. So we're going to see if we can hit them all. I'm just going to have one person answer. And if you can just try to keep your answers succinct. We are talking to a lot of practitioners and school leaders on the call right now in the audience. So we've talked a lot about all of these skills that are needed to get into the career or into the workforce. And all of the skills to progress in the workforce, but pivoting to schools, what would you like to see schools do regarding SEL to best prepare young people for the workforce? And if you have a thought, you can just hop in there real quick. What would you like to see schools do regarding SEL to better prepare young people for the workforce?
I've got a very short answer for this.
Great.
Integrate it into the curriculum and train adults on how to actually work with kids from that perspective.
Perfect. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Mm-hmm.
Develop cultural competency. I think it's really important, especially depending on the demographic that you're working in, where you're coming from. I think cultural competency is important, especially when we talk about implicit biases or prejudices in terms of how we work with students. And so that I think is really, really, really important.
Awesome. This one is very relevant. In the hybrid work model, what strategies come to mind on how to improve SEL remotely? I'll say it again. In the hybrid work model, what strategies come to mind on how to improve SEL remotely? It's a different skill set for a lot of people. Ray, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing challenge right now. I just say personally, I'm in the camp where there are some elements of SEL that can be cultivated, taught, in sort of a classroom-based or lecture-based model. But for me, in my personal experience, and what we try to do at Shift Up is it's a lot more experiential. At least, so we're actively struggling with this. I think if there's ways that you can continue to push on experiential and sort of team-based and sort of models that are virtual, you probably have a lot more success, especially with developing a variety of important social emotional learning skills.
Awesome. Anyone else? Any thoughts on hybrid SEL skills or like hybrid work model working remotely? Okay. I'm going to keep us moving. This might be for Emily, but anyone can jump in. What tip would you give to junior and mid-level employees who do a lot of the hands-on work, the player work in the scenario you were mentioning, to help prepare for the more managerial coach work that lies ahead in our careers?
I can definitely jump in here with a quick one. Those conversations around feedback, similar to that, also have conversations with the people who are above you around where you want to go, because then they can help curate opportunities for you to get some stretch assignments that can help grow you and build some of those core skills. So when the next opportunity is available to move into more of coach level work, if you're doing player work, you're more ready than somebody who hasn't had access to those. And of course, sometimes it might feel like I'm doing extra work and not getting paid, but sometimes you have to think about it I'm investing in the next phase of my career. And so short-term pain might get you some real long-term wins. Also be mindful of so when you're doing some of those things, have those conversations. So don't just take on a whole bunch of extra work, but not talk about, hey, so what's coming down the pipeline? Are there upcoming opportunities? If it's not within your existing department or division, also look outside of that department or division or to some other organizations that might have comparable growth roles and where you can start networking and making connections and be able to talk openly about the work you did. And I think whenever you're assigned a stretch opportunity, also think about how you measure the impact that it made on the organization. So if you had an opportunity and you helped increase revenue from $100,000 to $500,000, those are really important talking points that you need to carry with you to your next experience. So don't just do the work, but also take the quantifiable and real anecdotal examples of what you did, because that helps build your narrative. So when they ask you, tell me about yourself, you can add some real meat to that outside of just the places that you've been and the work that you've done.
And if I can add to that, I think it's also understanding the experiences that you need to get to the next level that you want to get to. And there's other ways to get those experiences versus directly being in that role, right? So that can be getting those experiences if you have ERG groups or affinity groups or community organizations where you can lend your expertise and your skills, and you want to get exposure on how to manage groups and people. There are other ways to get those experiences versus I need to actually be in that job. And when you get those experiences from those other places, that positions you and sets you up better for that next opportunity.
Thank you. Well, we will stop there. I feel like I'm on MSNBC. We have 30 seconds left. To the audience, thank you all so much for joining us today. Please show your appreciation to the panelists in the chat. You all were wonderful, and I learned a lot from my own career progression. So thank you so much. And you can look below, audience members, to go to the agenda to navigate to the next session. And then you just have to choose join for whichever session you want to go to. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you all. Have a great day.